Welcome, I'm Michele Levine, CEO at Roy Morgan. For those who came for an end of financial year update, the workforce has contracted for the third month in a row. Consumer confidence and business confidence are in the doldrums. Interest rates, inflation and Australians' inflation expectations are high. Mortgage stress is high and increasing. The Australian dollar, the gold price and productivity are slipping. But I'm delighted to tell you that this is not a standard end-of-year financial update. This is a living, breathing story about risk. And it's a story about velocity, because uncertainty and risk are not simply high, they're moving faster than the instruments most companies rely on to see them. Now, nobody knows what's going to happen, but it's going to be wonderful for some. It's the old winners and losers story. Winners will be those who navigate eyes wide open, ears wide open, and all synapses firing, processing the multitude of signals presenting every day. Over the next half hour, I want to show you that the risks that matter most to your organisation are forming in places your dashboards, reports, and metrics are not looking, and that there's now a way to see them coming and a science to navigate them. I want to start with a simple question. Look at this chart. What does it tell you? It shows where Australians extend trust to companies and institutions. It looks pretty good. If you were a leader reviewing this at a board meeting about your company, you might be quite relaxed and even feel the story it tells is positive news. And you'd not be wrong as far as it goes. This is the picture most leaders see. In fact, it may be the one that they insist on seeing. But in a moment, I'm going to add another dimension, and everything changes. This is distrust, a disturbingly different picture. Not the opposite picture, not a mirror image, a different picture. Distrust is not low trust or no trust. It's an active state. It carries suspicion, anger, perceived unfairness, and the pathway to punishment. Now subtract distrust from trust and you get a single figure, the net score. That's the black line. And this is the number and the picture your board should be watching, because it isolates the dangerous part of the risk, the part that moves faster, the part people talk about, the part that makes customers less forgiving, voters less loyal, employees less committed, and communities less willing to give organisations the benefit of the doubt. Trust tells you how you're doing. The net score tells you where you're exposed. And this leads directly to our central argument. Positive metrics like trust tell organisations how they're performing. Negative metrics warn them where they are at risk. A serious governance system needs both, because risk doesn't always announce itself as falling performance. Very often, it begins as rising rejection. Now, this argument has a history. 2 years ago, my colleague, social scientist Dr. Ross Honeywell, and I were invited to contribute a chapter to Age of Doubt, edited by the ABC's Tracy Kirkland and Gavin Fang, and published by Monash University Press. In it, we argued that distrust has become one of the defining tensions of modern life. Trust is what allows societies, markets and institutions to function, and is especially important when uncertainty requires agility. Distrust is the force that reveals where they're starting to fracture. And today, I want to take that argument further, because distrust is only the beginning. Since that book was published, we've entered the age of dissent, and leaders now need a new way to measure the negative states fermenting beneath the common metrics like confidence, satisfaction, advocacy, and reputation. If we think about the corporate crises we've seen over the last decade, now Roy Morgan's analysed 17 of them in depth, some of those are real gotcha moments when laws and contracts were broken. Some are more insidious, socio-political, environmental changes, where the basis of the social contract changes, and the gotcha moment is about unwritten, unspoken contract or a broken heart. In the current environment, the most important risks are often not visible to or even looked for by our business or political leaders. In the real world, risks are forming in people's minds, in their fears, in their anger, and in the decisions of dissent they're beginning to make. One of the big stories in this presentation is that the risks that matter most aren't visible in the metrics that determine how leaders are rewarded, or how anyone's rewarded, really. Most organisations have more KPIs and dashboards than they need, but most are built around positive measures: trust, satisfaction, confidence, advocacy, reputation. They measure degrees of good news, but they don't tell us the bad news. And they can conceal what's becoming dangerous. So the problem's not a lack of measurement, it's lopsided measurement. Looking at the list, these positive measures are important, and I'm not arguing against them, but they create a false sense of comfort. They look for positives, they track positives, they reward positives. And when executive bonuses are built around them, leaders learn very quickly what to see and what not to see. And so their reports do exactly the same. It's axiomatic that the behaviour you reward is the behaviour you get. We all know that. If boards reward leaders for lifting NPS, satisfaction or trust, leaders will optimise for those measures. And worse, it's all they'll optimise for and all they'll measure. So it becomes a self-serving loop. Measure the things that reward us, ask the people who already belong to us, and tell stakeholders how well we're doing. Standard KPIs don't find the early warning signs of risk, but even worse, they reward people for turning a blind eye to them. We call this moral blindness, because when the warning signs aren't measured, reported, or rewarded when acted on, they become invisible. And what becomes invisible becomes unmanageable. It goes without saying that what is visible and measured is manageable, or at least able to be navigated. And for boards themselves, risk has sadly become too much of a tick-the-box compliance issue. The question has become, are we doing what's required of us by the regulators and the statutes? But the more important question is, where are our risk issues? And where are they most dangerous? Where are our key stakeholders, like the customer, the citizen, employee, or community, beginning to turn against us? Take reputation, for example. It's almost irrelevant as a risk diagnostic. Only 9% of Australians credit reputation as a reason to trust a brand, and only 6% blame a poor reputation as a reason to distrust a brand. People think in much plainer, more human terms: how they were treated, whether the value exchange feels fair, whether the company is honest, whether leadership can be trusted. If leaders are staring at reputation while the real risk is forming somewhere else, that starts to look very much like moral blindness. Nothing to see here. Before we go further into Roy Morgan's data, I want to pause on the measurement problem itself. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to step out of the CEO role and into the academic argument, because this is not only a business issue, it's a psychometric issue. Positive-only metrics usually treat experience as a unipolar continuum, more or less of a good thing. But absence and opposite are not the same. A low satisfaction score does not necessarily measure hostility. A low advocacy score doesn't necessarily measure dissent. If the construct is wrong, the instrument is wrong. So the deepest problem is so-called signal detection failure. The behaviours that matter most for risk, like warning others off, refusing to re-engage, agitating for punishment, encouraging boycotts, dissuading others, are not simply low scores on a positive measure. They're the missing signals in a positive-only instrument. By default, in a positive-only instrument, there are no negative signals. Signal detection failure is inevitable. So to wrap up this dissertation, the answer is not merely to reverse the scale. We have to invert the question. Don't ask only, will you recommend? Ask, will you reject? Don't ask only, are you satisfied? Ask, are you dissatisfied, and why? Don't ask only, do you trust? Ask, do you distrust, and why? In risk measurement, the unit of interest is not flattering sentiment. It's harmful behaviour. Mortarboard off, business hat back on, because once you accept the inversion principle, the next question's obvious. Where can we apply it? What do we do about it? And distrust is where Roy Morgan started, and we've spent 8 years proving it works. Distrust has been our proof of concept. Roy Morgan didn't simply measure the low end of trust. We separated trust and distrust, measured them directly, and importantly, asked people why. And when we do the analysis of the why, we've treated it as if it's two separate planets, planet positive and planet negative, planet trust and planet distrust, keeping them separate. In fact, that was the breakthrough. Once you name the negative and measure it as its own state, the market becomes so much more intelligible. So let's apply it. This chart tells a specific story about Australia. The net trust score, trust minus distrust, crossed below zero in 2020, and it has not recovered. That means, at a national level, more Australians are distrusting than trusting. This is not a data point. It's a structural, social, political, and economic shift. And when you overlay it with the economic and political data that we'll look at shortly, the picture becomes even more urgent. At Roy Morgan, we believe that Australia itself needs to be treated as an early warning system. When the Australian psyche sits in the crisis zone on the risk magnitude scale, that's not just a psychosocial indicator, it's a behavioural warning. People have become more cautious, more suspicious, more resentful, and less willing to absorb disappointment. And in a cost of living crisis, affordability is not just a price issue, it becomes a fairness issue, a moral judgment. If people believe companies are charging too much while they're struggling, distrust soars. Just ask Coles or Woolworths. Commercial success starts to look like exploitation. This is why distrust is so important. And look at this chart. It measures profit as a driver of risk. Now, profit, of course, is not the problem. But when households feel they're struggling while companies win, it becomes a risk signal. If people believe companies are winning at their expense while they're struggling, distrust soars. Profit starts to look like greed. If you were just looking at the positives, that's the green, there really is nothing to see here. But there's a lot of red in this chart, major risk signals. This is a crisis. Again, just ask Woolworths or Coles or any company that announces big profits in Australia. Now, I'm often asked how long it takes to recover from a crisis. And I know people are hoping or expecting me to say something like 12 months or 18 months. You can't always give people what they want. So what Roy Morgan created is a benchmark recovery rate. against which to measure recovery of brands, industries, and even the entire country. For example, after 12 months, 92% of brands hadn't fully recovered. After 2 years, 75% hadn't recovered. 50% still hadn't recovered after 4 years, and even after 5 years, 25% had not fully recovered. The black line here is the benchmark recovery rate. And we see Australia hit its lowest point in terms of net distrust in the month of February 2024. And we're not doing well. See the green line. At this rate, we have another 5 years of Australians being more distrusting than trusting. Now, let's turn to the main offenders in positive scale measurement from a risk intelligence perspective. Net Promoter Score, or NPS, every executive's favourite positive metric, has become one of the great card tricks. It asks a simple question of its customers, and only customers. How likely are you to recommend this company, this product, this service, whatever? And that question has value. Advocacy matters. But it's still a positive scale instrument. It doesn't properly ask who will speak against you. And that's the blind spot. A person who's unlikely to recommend may not recommend anyone. They might be indifferent, disengaged, busy, forgetful, or just not the type of person who gives recommendations. But a person who actively discourages others and rejects the brand is different. They're not passive, they're activists. Through the risk lens, the question is not just who will recommend. The risk question is, who will tell people to reject us? And that's where NPS fails as a risk instrument. It can net positives and create a reassuring score, while the commercially dangerous behaviour is fermenting somewhere else completely. In risk terms, the person who says, I would never use them again and I tell everyone I know not to use them, is not just a low promoter. So risk intelligence asks a different question. How much active rejection are we generating? Where is it coming from? And how far is it travelling? Customer satisfaction is another important measure. It tells us whether the people still in the relationship are broadly content, and clearly that matters. But satisfaction can also create comfort, like NPS. It's usually asked of customers, often current or recent customers, and again, like NPS, misses ex-customers, never customers, and potential customers. A customer who's not satisfied is not necessarily angry. They might be mildly disappointed, uncertain, distracted, or open to being won back. But dissatisfaction, in the risk sense, is different. It's where disappointment starts to become grievance. It's where people begin to feel that the company has been unfair, careless, dishonest, or indifferent. And this is the danger zone. Because once dissatisfaction becomes grievance, the behaviour changes. People complain, they avoid, they get angry, they go to a competitor, and they tell others. They stop giving the brand the benefit of the doubt. Sounds a little bit like our current political environment. So risk intelligence asks a sharper question. Not only how satisfied are our customers or voters, but where is disappointment becoming anger? And where is anger becoming action? Now, AI is a perfect example of why positive measures can mislead us. If we only measure adoption, the story looks simple. Australians are using AI, experimenting with it, finding productivity benefits, and bringing it into their work and personal lives. And all that is true, but it's not the whole truth. Roy Morgan's national data shows that a growing majority of Australians, now 65%, believe AI creates more problems than it solves. And in fact, 1 in 4 Australians believe AI presents a risk of human extinction in the next 2 decades. So adoption and anxiety are rising together. Usage is not the same as trust. Trial is not the same as comfort. Curiosity is not the same as confidence. But the most important part of this data is not just the percentage, it's the reasons. When Australians say AI creates more problems than it solves, they're naming the risk map. Loss of critical thinking and creativity, inaccuracy and hallucinations, disinformation, scams and deep fakes, job losses, privacy, surveillance, environmental impact and control. These are not just kind of passing comments. They're deeply felt. And more importantly, they are the early warnings. And this is where Roy Morgan's open-ended data is so important. The number gives us scale, the reasons give us direction. They show us what people believe is at stake, what makes them afraid, and what kind of promise or mitigation they'll need before they can trust the change. So AI is not just a technology story, it's a risk intelligence story. The future of AI adoption will not be decided only by capability. It'll also be decided by whether people believe the risks are understood, governed, and made humanly safe. Now, let's look at consumer confidence. ANZ Roy Morgan Consumer Confidence. We see the same positive-negative issue in consumer confidence. The index has a neutral point of 100. Above 100, optimism outweighs pessimism. Below 100, pessimism outweighs optimism. But the language we use often softens that reality. We say confidence is low, 72.8, as though it was still a positive condition, just weaker than we'd like it to be. But anything below 100 is not weak positivity, it's net pessimism. It's a negative metric. Really, should we be saying it's negative 27.2? Then we'd really get it. And that distinction matters because pessimism changes behaviour. People delay, they defer, they cut back, they wait, they become harder to persuade, harder to reassure, and slower to re-enter the market. So the risk intelligence question is not only what's the consumer confidence score, it's how deep is the confidence deficit or pessimism? Who's carrying it? And what behaviour is it producing? And it's not only households. Roy Morgan's Business Confidence Index has just hit a record low, 76.1 in May. That's below even the COVID depths of April 2020. Remember, 100's the neutral line. Above it, optimism outweighs pessimism. Below it, the reverse. In negative terms, that's minus 23.9. Business has now spent an extended stretch in negative territory, and the long arc tells the story. Confidence has been trending down, or pessimism growing, since 2013, with only a very brief partial recovery after COVID, before falling away again. So the pessimism we just saw in households is mirrored on the other side of the economy among the businesses that employ and sell to those households. This matters for risk because when consumers and businesses are pessimistic at the same time, caution compounds. Households delay and defer, businesses postpone investment and hiring, and each side's caution confirms the others. That's a self-reinforcing negative signal and exactly the condition risk intelligence is built to detect before it hardens. Now, before I explain this political data, I want to be clear about how I'm framing it. I'm not making a political argument. What I'm revealing is risk intelligence, specifically a measure of the scale of defection from mainstream institutions. So with that framing in mind, Roy Morgan's latest federal polling shows One Nation leading the primary vote for a third straight week at 31.5%, ahead of the ALP at 27% and the LNP coalition at 17.5%. Now, that's not just a political poll. It's evidence that dissent at scale has crossed from sentiment into behaviour. Our nation has been politically fragile ever since the other vote became close to that of the major parties. By the 2022 federal election, it was close. By 2025, other was higher than the LNP coalition and only marginally below Labor. It tells us that dissent is no longer sitting quietly as frustration. It's activated into defection. An ocean of voters is not just disappointed with mainstream politics, they are turning their back on it. And that's the negative arc in public life. Doubt becomes suspicion, suspicion becomes fear, fear becomes anger, anger becomes rejection, and rejection becomes defection. This is part of a wider global pattern. Donald Trump changed the permission structure around radical dissent. He showed that a politician could promise to change the world order, begin doing exactly that. And despite warnings of Armageddon, the world would keep operating. Now that matters because what was once unthinkable becomes thinkable. What was socially unacceptable becomes expressible. And then very quickly, it can become the new political weather. The point here is not partisan. The point is behavioural. In a negative scale reality, dissent does not always remain dissent. Under the right conditions, it becomes defection. In Australia, this is played out with the right conditions permitting people to defect to Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party, over 5 million people. I want to pause here because I think this is the most important structural point in the whole presentation. What we've just looked at, AI anxiety, consumer confidence deficits, and political defection, are not 3 separate news stories. They're not 3 different research projects or 3 different risk registers. They're the same thing, a condition of generalised distrust in institutions and in the future, expressing itself simultaneously in technology, in economics, and in politics. The Australians who believe AI creates more problems than it solves are the same people who are more pessimistic than optimistic about the economy, and who are turning their backs on the institutions that are supposed to serve them. Risk in the age of dissent does not sit in categories. It moves through populations, and that's precisely why a system that measures it must do the same. And the same force operates in markets. A customer who feels ignored, exploited, or morally betrayed doesn't simply become less satisfied. They leave. They warn others. They punish the brand. They recruit others into rejection. And that's why negative states matter so much. They're alive. They move through households, workplaces, friendship groups, media, social platforms, and communities. They become stories, what we know as narrative economics. They become warnings. They become reasons not to buy, not to trust, not to vote, not to return. That's why risk intelligence has to measure not only sentiment, but motion. Where is the negative moving? Who's carrying it? What is it attaching to? And what behaviour is it beginning to produce? So the board level question must change. Not just, are we complying? Not just, are our satisfaction scores high? Not just, did NPS move a point? The real question is, where is the risk? Where are people beginning to reject us and why? Where are our customers becoming rejectors? Where is dissatisfaction becoming grievance? Where is confidence becoming pessimism? Where is technology adoption carrying fear? Where is dissent becoming defection? Those aren't soft questions. They're hard risk questions. They're growth questions, and they're governance questions. This is the discipline that Roy Morgan's Risk Lab is formalising as risk intelligence. It began with distrust, but it doesn't end there. The same logic applies wherever the negative state is more predictive of risk than the positive state is of comfort. Distrust, rejection, dissatisfaction, confidence deficit, AI and data harm anxiety, employee disengagement, social license withdrawal. These aren't just negative words, they're risk lenses. I want to be honest about where this argument comes from. When Ross Honeywell and I were writing our chapter for Age of Doubt, we weren't writing a product brief. We were trying really hard to answer a question that had genuinely been troubling us. Why do organisations keep being surprised by risk events that in retrospect had been visible for months? And the answer we kept coming back to was measurement. Not a lack of it, an excess of the wrong kind. Risk intelligence is our answer to that question. And Roy Morgan can lead it not because we decided to, but because we've already proven the principle. An early warning system for seeing risk before it becomes consequence. In the age of dissent, growth depends on more than understanding what people want. That's important. But growth now depends on seeing earlier than anyone else what they fear, what they reject, what they warn others against, and what they're beginning to move away from. Positive metrics show the surface. Risk intelligence reveals what's fermenting beneath the surface. And for leaders, boards, and institutions, that may be the difference between being reassured by the metrics and being ready for a damaging crisis, ready to avoid it, turn it around, or take advantage of it. Because in the end, the danger is not only that uncertainty is rising, it's the speed or velocity of it. So let me close with an invitation rather than a summary. I've assumed that the intelligence around opportunities and positive momentum and growth are well understood, or at least visible. The argument today has been about measurement, about what we see and are choosing to see, and what we are choosing not to see. Risk intelligence is a practical response to that. The questions on this slide aren't rhetorical. They're the questions that Roy Morgan can answer today using real data, tracked over time, with reasons. Hundreds of thousands of verbatim reasons from people who are telling us why they distrust. If any of those questions feel urgent, that's probably a signal worth acting on. I encourage you to reach out to us at the Risk Lab directly. The conversation is worth having before the risk becomes visible on the metrics that missed it. Thank you for listening. Look forward to seeing you next time.